I'm your host, Soraya Sinozie, and this is Diaspora and Development, where we give voice to people of the diaspora working in international development. I'm your host, Soraya Sinozie, and this is Diaspora and Development. On the first episode of 2024, we talked climate change with Blessing Uwe and Sequoia Riley. We caught Blessing on her return from COP28 in Dubai. Blessing is the West Africa coordinator of Net Zero as soon as possible, which aims to achieve the 2060 agenda of zero emissions. Blessing is also the founder of Young Advocates for Sustainable and Inclusive Future, Nigeria. Dr. Sequoia Riley is a research associate at HARC, focusing on the water, climate, energy nexus. Her research specializations and interests include urban environmental planning and management, green infrastructure, flood disaster risk management, adaptive governance, and environmental justice efforts in the context of urban and rural flood sustainability and resilience. You'll find more on our guest and their work in the show notes. Let's get into it. Thank you, Blessing and Sequoia, for joining me today. I'm very happy to have you for this conversation on climate change. Sequoia, can you tell us a little bit about your background, your focus on water, climate, energy nexus? Can you explain what that means and what led you to this field?
Sure. Thank you for bringing me onto your podcast. So I currently work at HARC, which stands for Houston Advanced Research Center. My position is a research associate in, as you stated, Soraya, climate, energy, water nexus. And what that means is doing research focused on stormwater quality improvement and stormwater runoff reduction, clean energy such as green technology, such as wind and solar power and on-site electricity generation, and climate being erosion control, storm surge issues and mitigation, wildfire and agriculture. But wildfire is not really looked into here. Overall, what I look into is researching different problems that are happening here in Houston and coastal Texas, and then also determining innovative solutions such as green infrastructure and green technology. So how I came into this is my bachelor's is in marine biology and marine science. And I realized after going to 2 different internships within my undergrad, I didn't want to continue with that anymore because I just found it boring. It was just so repetitive. And then I decided to go for my master's. And so my master's is in marine resource management with the focus on coastal resilience. And it was there that my advisor / professor taught coastal resilience planning, a class that I honestly did not want to take, but I took it anyway. And that's what really set the flames, if you will, on me learning more about urban and regional planning.
And what exactly in that class set the flame?
It was not just seeing how coastal resilience plans are set or how they're put together, but also I still remember to this day in one of the classes, we were discussing, I think, either coastal Texas or coastal Louisiana about how flooding is just going to get worse and worse. And a lot of the residents, especially people of color, Black folks, they won't leave. And I asked him, why can't they leave? My knowledge was very limited. I obviously did not know. And he explained that some people can't. They don't have the finances to leave, or they have had generations of people and family who have lived in that area that's their home. That's where their culture is. And they refuse to leave. And that's what blew my mind. It didn't even register to me over the fact of it being a cultural thing as well. So that's what set the flame, was understanding that it was those 2 things. And I'm sure there were other reasons I just can't remember at the top of my head right now. The Black American community do not have the resources, or they just refuse to leave because that is their home and they will stay there.
That idea that they're not going to leave, a lot of people are tied to their land, especially people living by the coast, and you have history, etc. Is your idea going into this field to find a solution or to find resilience?
My doctorate is in urban and regional planning, and I focused on specializing in environmental planning and management, flood disaster risk management, adaptive governance, and green infrastructure. So overall, I say all that to say that all that combined is focused on coastal and urban resilience and sustainability.
Thank you. Blessing, among your many accomplishments, you're the West Africa coordinator of the Net Zero as soon as possible and founded the Young Advocates for a Sustainable and Inclusive Future. Can you tell us what led you to a career in climate change and what led you to advocacy?
Thank you, Soraya. For me, what led me to advocate in the area of climate change is from a personal experience. That's where I built my passion from. When I was much younger, back at my family home in Cross River State, my family got displaced from flooding. And growing up, I did realize that it was as a result of blocked drainages. We had more drainages that were blocked as a result of plastic pollution and all of that. And community members were not aware that they own themselves a responsibility to ensure that their drainages are kept open, to allow free flow of water. They felt that was the government's responsibility. I guess that's because of the lack of awareness. And having gone through my undergrad, I started discovering that I had a thing for waste management, community waste management, and also community empowerment. And I started talking to people about waste management. And then I took a career around climate change and started to merge it where we manage waste as a means of also creating or promoting environmental sustainability while we talk about climate action. That was where I also started working with communities. And then I started YASIF Nigeria, which is a young advocate for sustainable and inclusive future, where we mobilize young people, we train them to go back to their communities, retrain them or step down the trainings. I decided to pick a niche or an area of focus, which was waste management, because climate change itself is broad. And I believe so much strongly that if we're able to get community members to manage their waste properly, they'll be able to, in their own little way, reduce flooding as much as they can and also promote environmental sustainability. So that was the first thing that brought me into the whole climate change space. It was from there I also got interested in other areas of climate change, where I got to work with the Net Zero as soon as possible, a workplace climate ambassador scheme, where I get to talk to people, especially across workplaces, how they can also promote climate action in their workspaces. I think the general thing for this, for me, is helping people take ownership or responsibility towards climate action, because I started it at the community level, where I speak to people about proper waste management, recycling, value in plastics, seeing value in things that you originally call waste, taking responsibility and owning up to that. And decided to move with people in workplaces, be it the business area whatsoever, helping them understand that regardless of what you do, you have a role to play towards climate action, and you need to take responsibility towards promoting your own quota for the environment, not necessarily waiting for the government or some individuals to come and do that for you. So for me, that was what pushed me into the whole climate change space. I wanted to see what I could do in my own little way to see that I'm able to push for change, instead of complaining like every other person does, like, okay, we have to wait for the government to come and help us in this situation. And if the government is not coming, what then do we do? Okay. So for me, that's just the thing here.
You talked about experiencing displacement because of flooding. What was the experience like? Were you able to return? I think it's very important to talk about displacement, especially in terms of climate change, and that's what a lot of people are facing. So if you could tell us a little bit about that experience, I'd be very happy.
Yeah, we didn't return because as at that time, the issue was reoccurrence. Mm-hmm. It started more like flooding, okay, outside this field and all of that. And gradually it started getting into the house. I could recall one day I was at home with my parents, and the water got to a certain level. And I think I was having my lunch. My dad had to put some tables and chairs, put everything on top and all that so that I could climb up and then continue my lunch. I recall then, I don't know, maybe because it wasn't balanced, I fell off into the water with my food and all of that. It was really frustrating for them because they wanted to control the situation. They don't know how to explain it to their children that they are not able to control this kind of situation where you get to be in the house with your family and then you have water all over the place, getting everything spoiled. And the next decision my dad had to make was to see how we can move. We did not plan the moving because we didn't have money then to get another place, but that was the thing he could do. He couldn't stay till another morning. Most of our things got bad as a result of that, and we had to move and started building all over again, which is really something serious. And from there, growing up, I keep remembering that and I keep asking myself. So I've walked around the states or the city and then try to see how I can do some observation, realizing that some of the drainages are blocked. I mean, you have people train everything, because they feel, okay, the government did not give us a disposable what to dispose our waste in. We'll just throw it anywhere. Oh, that's an opening. We'll just put it inside. We'll believe the water will take it to wherever it is taking it to. What they don't understand is these things get to a particular point and they completely block these drainages, and then the water do not have channels to pass through. So they get to remain on the surface and it becomes a disaster. That's one way I decided to talk to people, because if I had known, probably my parent had known, would have set up a community exercise where everybody gets to clean their drainages and see how we can push for the change. But I didn't know that. I was too young for that. So I decided to take up that responsibility to speak with communities at this point so that they are able to take up that challenge and understand that the little things they do affect the environment. And then also they have a role to play to ensuring that they don't push it too far. Rather, they look for ways to sustain the environment and do the little bits that they can.
Thank you. Hoya, you have a specific interest in environmental justice efforts, and blessing you're a climate activist. There's little focus on environmental justice led by people of color and little on how climate change has a particular adverse effect on Black and Brown people. Can you both speak about environmental justice initiatives led by people of color and just why climate change affects these communities so greatly? Who wants to take it first?
I can take it first if Blessing, you're okay with that. Yeah, okay. So first thing, as far as people of color who have led environmental justice initiatives and efforts, one person I want to point out is Dr. Robert Bullard. He has been dubbed as the father of environmental justice, and he is a highly esteemed and decorated advocate. He's currently a distinguished professor of urban planning and environmental policy and the director of the Bullard Center for Environmental and Climate Justice here in Houston, Texas. And he is, a award-winning author. He's been invited to the White House. He's been, I believe he's been awarded, I can't quite remember, something at the White House. And he's also a co-founder of the HBCU Climate Change Consortium. Wrote many books focused on environmental racism, urban land use, industrial facility siting, community reinvestment, housing, transportation, you name it. And that is one of many that I can think of at the top of my head that has led environmental justice initiatives. Now, as far as why climate justice affects Black and Brown communities so greatly, historically, if you look at what has occurred as far as housing goes in terms of redlining neighborhoods, that has, I believe, still to this day taken place. And what that means is it has restricted low income and people of color, again, Black and Brown people, to get mortgage loans from banks, leaving them to live in areas next to either gas and oil industries, floodplains, and levees. So that has detrimented their physical and mental health issues, along with there being an equitable distribution of the proper resources that is needed for them should a major storm hit their area. And it just makes them highly susceptible to ongoing and recurring and even more intense storm events, even erosion if you live in coastal areas as well. And so in addition to that, their voices are not being heard on what they need. And when their voices are heard, no action is being done to help their communities, which has led to a lot of skepticism as far as their properties that live in close vicinity that are continuing to be built, leaving them behind socially and economically, benefiting from what companies have gained.
Thanks a lot, Sequoia. That's the point of view of Black Americans, African Americans living in the United States. Blessing, can you tell us a little bit about what happens in your region and if you have any environmental justice led by people like you?
Yeah, there's so much. When you say people of color, here we don't have white people, but then we still are somehow affected when it comes to environmental injustice, especially when you talk about some of these industries that are owned by people from the Western countries. So Recently, my organization, we had a consultation meeting with the people from the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. That's where the oil production side is, so where you have the oil wells and all of that. One of the challenge of the Niger Delta people is what you call environmental injustice, because these people come to mine oil or build factories in their communities and end up polluting everywhere, leaving their land bare and unfruitful, especially when it comes to agriculture, polluting their waters in such a way that people can no longer go fishing, and no compensation whatsoever. And these communities end up suffering some set of setback and poverty, because the only thing they know, their primary occupation, is either agriculture or farming, and these livelihood opportunities have been taken away from them, and there are no justifiable ways to bring, or should I say, no means of bringing justice to them, because these people are high up there, they have something or an agreement with the government, and then the community people feel that their voices are not heard. I'll just give you some instances. Some of these communities have been affected. There's one called the Ogoni land. That community has been really, really affected by oil pollution. And then another one is the Ayotere community. That one is, even we got to know about it recently during our studies and realized that 80% of the community is taken away. So the people are barely living. It's like they call it the city that is almost going extinct there, because first and foremost, these oil companies have destroyed the land. The water is no longer fit for drinking. The people can barely live or can barely feed, and then the government is not doing anything about it. I understand that groups from the Niger Delta region people have formed groups to be able to speak their rights to freedom. There is a group called the Egbema Voice of Freedom. It was formed so people could speak out their rights, and then they need to be heard that this land belongs to us. This land is ancestral to us. We have been living here. We have been feeding from this land. So you cannot take it away from us as a result of your oil exploration and all of that. And then there are no compensation whatsoever for some of these damages that we cause. I understand that it's really difficult. So I'm coming from the perspective of these indigenous people, because they are the most powerless. When you look at how the state is, the indigenous people are the most powerless. They are the grassroots. They do not have a voice, maybe because people feel they do not have an education, and then they get to, like, you just come into the community, you make your deals, your plans with the government, and then they give you that piece of land. And people actually reside in these lands. When you take it away from them, you just treat these people like animals, and then they do not have a voice, because you're powerful and you have money. So recently, some people from the Niger Delta region, I think from the Ogoni community, some of the very learned ones who have a voice and understand some of this activism, had to take up the case with Shell, one of the companies in the Niger Delta region. I think it took years, but recently we heard that they were able to push forward and were able to get compensation from Shell for the damage that they have caused. So that's just like 10% of the entire Niger Delta region. Maybe because these people understand their rights and understand where and how they can go for it.
I asked particularly to interject about Black and Brown people and understanding that Nigeria's composition is different. But if you see what Sequoia spoke about and what you're speaking about, there are so many synergies. I recently completed a master's on called Entitled Cities. And I looked at Latin American and Caribbean coastal cities and how they're affected by climate change. And, to do some of the research, you have to look at coastal cities around the world. And what I see is that particular affectation for communities from Latin America and Caribbean, from Africa, are being affected adversely. And there are a lot of similarities. So it was interesting. It's interesting to hear what you have to say, Blessing, and to hear what you have to say, Sequoia, and see from so far, from two different continents, these synergies. Please continue, Blessing.
Yes, that's what it is. I could recall recently we had an issue in Port Harcourt. That's another area in Niger Delta where you had the pollution of soot, of this black thing in the atmosphere, that if people sneeze, you sneeze into a tissue or a white cloth, it's all black thing coming out from your nose. So it's result as in people started suffering from lung related issues. Some people started resulting from lung cancers. You're not smoking, you don't do drugs, but then you have issues with your lungs. And nobody seems to be doing anything about that. I mean, people have called out to the government that this thing is killing lives. I can also recall some other community in the Niger Delta where young people as young as 25 go into menopause.
Wow.
And this is as a result of the impact of this pollution when it comes to their health. Nobody's looking at that. So infertility rates begins to increase, especially when you talk about sexual and reproductive health and climate change. You have high infertility rate in these communities because these things in a way impact their health much more than we can imagine. And nobody's currently doing anything about it. Communities have come out calling for compensation. And then another thing I realized with some of these communities is that they do not even know their rights. They do not even know what these things it's doing to the environment. So what some of these polluters come to do is when they come, in order to shut them up, they give them like a few change here and there, you know. And then the community is happy and like, oh my God, we have food to eat today. Go ahead and do whatever it is you want to do, not knowing that these things affect their present and even affect the future of their children. If they have this knowledge as to the impact of this pollution in their environment, they'll work so hard to protect it, if not for themselves, for their children and for the future of their children. So that's another thing I did realize with these communities is the lack of awareness and people do not know how much these things impact their health and how much some of the health related issues they've been having and how it's associated to this pollution and all of that. So which gave us the concern that we even need to reach out to more grassroots people or the indigenous communities, helping them understand how these things affect them and how they can raise their voice to what is theirs, because this land is theirs. It's their ancestral land and it's their home. They have been farming in these lands for years, passing it from one generation to another, fishing in these areas. That is all they know how to do. And taking this from them is like sending the community to extinction because they cannot stay in the urban areas. They are not trained to stay in the urban areas. They are used to staying in their communities in the rural area, which is what they have been doing for years.
Do these impacts offer compensation or their livelihood restoration plans? When the communities are affected and displaced, what happens?
So in most cases, they are not compensated, except for a few who know their rights. Who now gets like, okay, we're going to build a community school, maybe free school, your children get to go to school, or we're going to, dig a borehole. Since your waters are not clean enough for drinking, we'll make boreholes so you can have access to clean water and all of that. These are the kind of things they use to calm the communities down. But in most cases, some of these community people do not receive the equal compensation as compared to the impact of the impact of the destruction that their activities have caused, because they don't know. And where we feel concerned is the fact that this is where you make your money, this is where you make your billions and all of that. And this community are barely living. You should be able to give them something reasonable enough to be able to make up for the destruction that you have caused. Come to an agreement with the community and let everybody be okay with your what you are doing at the community level. But I believe so far what I can say is that there have been so much politics and corruption that has mixed up with all of this, leaving the community people very defenseless, especially. So what they do sometimes it's to get to the community heads, like the people known as the gatekeepers, that's the chiefs and the kings and all of that. And then they're able to give them some reasonable amounts of money so that these kings or these chiefs shut the rest of the communities up. And that has really affected, or sometimes they build very good structures as per housing for these leaders or these community leaders somewhere at the outskirts where they are safe with their families. And that's just one way they buy, these people to not say a word, but then leaving the very vulnerable people back home, defenseless with nothing. The way the community system works here in Nigeria is whatever the chief says, that's what stands. So people do not speak on their own. They have to get the chief to buy into their idea. So it is the chief that speaks on their behalf. So once the chief is bought or his interest is bought, the people at that particular point become defenseless. So all they can do is just to, keep speaking and, keep until one day maybe somebody comes to their area.
Thank you. Sequoia, you also look at urban environmental planning. You touched on it a little. Obtained your PhD from University of Hawaii. What does environmental planning look like, particularly for coastal cities? Are there changes that can be made that can withstand these increasingly disastrous storms?
Yes. What does environmental planning look like? I would like to say, top three things is keeping existing green spaces as is, expanding the knowledge of socioecological systems in urban and coastal settings, and then also using a conceptual model of looking into how patterns of human and ecological processes emerge from interactions between human and the physical environment, physical components of the natural environment. So just to give a bit more detail on those top three, before I even go into that, the first thing I want to state is for listeners, environmental planning management has been defined as, the theory and practice of making good interrelated decisions about the natural environment, natural resources, wildlife, natural hazards, working landscapes such as farms and forests, and public health, air and water pollution, toxics, and waste disposal, and the built environment. And when I say built environment, I mean residential development, commercial development. So to go back to my three key points, the first thing is, as I mentioned before, keeping existing green spaces as is, meaning less changing of the area's land cover and land use, basically no development. Because the more development that occurs, the more climate issues that will continue to take place. I mean, of course, it's not just coastal areas, it's everywhere, that's being developed. But with this question being focused on coastal cities, that is really what's needed, because the more that you build, the more erosion that will take place, which means houses are going to be destroyed even more due to storm surges. And also, if, let's say, for example, a house is built on the very edge of a coastal area where there's a beach, erosion, the more that of the land that continues to either sink or desecrate or disappear, the house will fall down eventually. And that is why, keeping existing green spaces as is, because also those natural resources, they're there for a reason. They help to reduce flooding. They help to reduce any kind of natural risk that will happen. That is why those resources are there. Second thing, expanding knowledge of socioecological systems in urban and coastal settings. That can be done really by conducting community workshops, with experts and the local community residents. And more of what that can involve is looking at the socio-cultural and economic processes or social components, and then the biological and physical processes, the environmental components, in order to understand the urban areas, their integrated systems, and show government officials and local stakeholders to see how integrated those systems are. So basically, just looking to see how can these two systems that have been separated for the longest time coexist, to where our natural resources are not destroyed, yet we still are able to continue to develop in a different way, not so much, the same way that has been done, such as urban sprawling, because that's really what's destroying the environment and causing even more of the climate issues that we're seeing today, and it will continue to intensify. So
I think people might not know about urban sprawling. If you could just explain a little.
Sure. So urban sprawling, basically, if you look at Houston, for example, that's really the epitome of where you'll see urban sprawling. Basically, development is just continuing to spread across the land, and there's no regulation. There's no land use regulation keeping specific natural resources or the natural environment from being built. That's really what urban sprawling is. So basically, think of it as just, the spread of development and no restriction of land use, or I would say no restriction of where you can develop. And so that is really what is, again, also contributing a lot to the climate impacts that we see to this day. And then the third key component I wanted to get into is how I stated before about how you need to look at patterns of human and ecological processes, their interactions, and how that affects the ecological resilience in urban ecosystems. So those are my top 3 key points. And then how can we withstand such increasingly disastrous storms?
Mm-hmm.
I would say that it depends on how disastrous it is. If policies change, integrating science and hazard mitigation plan quality is improved in a heroic or Herculean effort, then it is possible. And society has to stop putting a value on the environment, or at least open people's eyes to understand how the natural environment can help everyone, not just one group that is of a particular socioeconomic level. It needs to be equitable. So that really involves, practicing the theory of environmental ethics and environmental economics. And so with environmental ethics, basically, just to kind of give 2 key points on that, the Western world views specifically how has kept us humans, isolated from nature, and that has resulted in a negative impact on a global scale. And so, humans, we are not taking accountability for the environmental harm that is caused, due to focus mainly being on satisfying our desires and our wants. So there's just a lot of consumption and no regard to looking at the environment. We're living in a society that is very much capitalism. Mm-hmm. So if the environment does not have a value, then our society is not going to look at that as something that is needed, which is very unfortunate. And that's just the Western culture. Actually, I don't even know if I would say Western. I want to say that's everywhere on a global scale. So as us as humans become addicted to income growth and just material consumption, there's going to be very little interest in looking into and understanding long-standing strategies, ethical relationships, and, practicing practical daily engagements between us and the natural environment. So we really need to look more into how can we make sure that us as humans continue to or start having a relationship with our environment, seeing the value of how that helps us not have to continue to deal with the climate issues that we see to this day. That's going to take a while, but it has to be done in a collective and individualistic aspect.
Okay. Blessing, you recently attended COP in Dubai. What was your experience like? Do you feel like great strides were made? Are we making changes through these events? And then Sequoia, after that, I'd like to get your opinion on COP in general.
Okay. I attended COP for only the first week, but then have been following the conversations after that. My focus was more on the loss and damage funds and then the phasing out of the fossil fuel, maybe because it's directly applies to the work that I do. I would say that the COP did not really meet our expectations, as we're very hopeful for this COP, because what we're looking at, especially for the loss and damage funds, was as raised during COP27 in Egypt, was to raise like about $400 billion funds for loss and damage. But so far, what was raised by parties was just about $700 million, which we feel is too small to address the issues around loss and damage, especially speaking about these communities that have been affected. That money is really quite small. I would say that people were somehow disappointed, especially with the parties not coming out to, especially the countries that are like the greater polluters. People were hoping that they will give out more, because the way the thing goes is, if you're polluting, then you should also release enough money so that we at the other end, who are not emitting so much, would use it as a means to mitigate climate change, because Africa just emits like 4% of the global emissions. So we are not the ones bringing out the whole, we're not the ones destroying the environment. But then it seems when it comes to the issues of loss and damage, we are always pleading for the funds. Before now, when it comes to loss and damage funds, this money comes as loans.
Mhm.
So they loan out the money to you.
They're
And
not grants.
yes, when you use it, you pay back sometimes with interest. And we are like, okay, we need to get this right. When we are asking for funds for loss and damage, we are not saying you should give us loans. We don't want loans. This is supposed to be an agreement. I mean, we were expecting our leaders to say more. And one of the challenges we've had, especially when it comes to COP, is the people who sit at the table. You just have to wish and hope and pray that they are able to represent your thoughts and concerns, because if they don't, you don't have a voice. We went there as observers. We are not privileged to speak or say anything as regarding these negotiations.
Some people think that people don't know. This is a very interesting thing, the way the UN COP works. And I also used to participate in the Commission of Status on Women yearly. And so there are official meetings where people have the right to speak, et cetera. And these are countries, et cetera. And then, of course, there's the side events. And in the side events, there's a lot of interesting conversations, but sometimes the two don't talk together. And so I guess, I wanted to just you're saying that you don't get to speak at the official meetings.
Yeah, so we just had to attend side events and then air our views there as much as we can. But then why we see that as a challenge, because when the agreement is done is at the plenary where the conversations, the real conversation is holding. For Africa, we had a major challenge with our leaders. Our leaders are talking about phasing down, that's reducing emission for fossil, while the civil societies are talking about phasing out completely, and then the indigenous people were talking about phasing out. So it's like there was no agreement. And where it became an issue is we just finished our first African Climate Summit with the intention of going as one Africa in one voice, so that we speak as Africans, not as heads of different states. But we got that wrong again. So Africa still went and then had division agreements, and this thing makes us weak. When West Africa is saying something different from East Africa is saying something different from South Africa, they see it that, okay, it seems Africans don't even know what they want. So the reason why we felt that the reason why we had our African Climate Summit before the COP was so that we come to an agreement of what we want. So we are going as one Africa, we are all speaking in one voice, but it didn't work out that way. So it's really a disappointment, I would say, because it's just sad to know that our leaders are talking about reducing emission instead of phasing out fossil fuel completely, which does not resonate with what we should want as Africa. We were hoping that they will say we need opportunities for green jobs or renewable energy, which is what we have been pushing for, because currently Africa is suffering. I don't know about other African countries, but Nigeria currently we are suffering a very high unemployment rate because we do not have work in these sectors again. And then the opportunities in the renewable energy space, and then nobody's talking about it. We were hoping our leaders would push more for that, but I think little was done as a result. Let's see what Africa will do post-COP. So we are kind of like watching and hoping. This year we had so many treaties being signed, and then most African countries joined, which is good. Let's just see what they do with that, because it's one thing to say we are going to work on something, it's another thing to actually work on them, which is one problem I know we face here in Nigeria with our leaders. When it comes to being active, when it comes to climate action, we have a lot of laws and policies, but implementation is very poor and it's very low. So we hope that having more of our leaders attend COP this year, that they are going to do something notable, such that people will know that actually Africa is really working hard. And for me personally, what I would say for the COP is, beyond asking for loss and damage funds, which we believe it's our right, we should also look at ways to be creative when it comes to solutions around climate action. I love what Ghana, the Guinea, and one other African country did. They were able to bring on a solution that they presented at COP, and it was adopted. That's what we want. We don't just want to go and say, oh, loss and damage funds. Like we leave our country only to talk about loss and damage funds. It makes us weak. We should be able to come out and say we have our solution, and you should support the solution because it's going to help save the world. We should also be, innovators and creators, and not just people who are just at the receiving end all the time.
Thank you. Sequoia, what's your opinion about COP?
I have several thoughts on that. But one thing I would like to say is I totally agree with what Blessina stated about bringing more Indigenous knowledge. That is most the utmost key that is definitely needed worldwide, and especially here in the States, because they have not been given the voice to, at least on a big platform, to provide their knowledge on how we can take care of our environment more, because the US is seeing that climate change is real. It is happening. Whether or not you like it, that's other people's opinions, but we see that it is becoming more intense and a lot more frequent. So my thoughts on COP is, while I believe that their intentions are good in regards to tackling climate change issues, I'm not seeing a lot of action that is taking place. That, to me, is a major issue. Unfortunately, I see it as kind of performative in a way, because of the fact that there's no action taking place, especially at the local level. I see COP as what's supposed to happen is you go to these events, you bring that knowledge of what you gain from there to put into action in your communities, in your country. So why isn't that happening? That I just don't quite understand. It could be politics, it could be something else. I don't have the knowledge of why, and I'm not going to claim that, I know as to why. And yeah, I think more action needs to take place. I know I've said action several times, but that is majorly key. And especially by bringing the knowledge back to the country, and again, focusing on the U.S., that should be shared to all the communities, especially Black and Brown communities too, to increase the knowledge capacity. Because that's the point of the COP, correct? Is to increase the knowledge capacity of what's going on, not just in other countries, but also how to bring that knowledge back to your own country as well, to reduce the kind of impacts that are happening. But there's just so much complexity, specifically here in the US, of the kind of impacts that are happening due to climate change that, I don't think COP is really the only solution to figure that out. It really does need to happen on the ground of talking to grassroots communities, because they're the ones who are being impacted the most, no? And
Exactly.
And it's, it really needs to start at the local level. International, yes, but very much so at the local level, especially in the political realm too.
That leads to my next question. We spent a lot of time talking about disaster risk management, mitigating risk. What can communities do to learn more about prevention instead of just having to respond to these major disasters?
Absolutely. So here in the US, I would say to get more communities to learn more about prevention, reach out to grassroots organizations, because there are plenty of communities that are called fence line communities, and that means those communities are living near or on land that is harming them. And also ask for workshops in their area. There's a lot of grassroots organizations who have very good leaders that can help with that, and then learn about the local policies that are impacting their area, reaching out to researchers at universities to come to their neighborhood and talk about prevention measures, and also, attend workshops led by engineers to learn from innovative solutions and the solutions that have existed for decades, if not centuries, to determine what can be done for their communities. But I would also like to add that it's not just communities that need to learn more about prevention. It really is a top-down, bottom-up approach. And what I mean by that is the bottom-up is, yes, the communities are the ones who are advocating for themselves, bringing their voices to the table, to the decision makers and the key stakeholders who are making the decisions of what's happening to the land that they live on now. But top-down, meaning those same stakeholders and decision makers also need to come and talk to these communities themselves. There has to be a balance of both parties coming to collaborate and communicate together to make the adaptations that are needed, both not just in policy, but also the actions of helping these same communities who are not receiving the proper resources. It's inequitable. It's a huge problem. So both those parties need to come together, meet in the middle, and talk about the issues, the impacts, and the solutions. And ultimately, it really does come down to the local communities, because they're the ones who are living through these kind of traumatic experiences.
Blessing, you, of course, are you go to communities. So can you tell us a little bit more about what communities can do to learn more about prevention? And you talk a lot about the responsibility of the community. Can you talk a little bit about the responsibility of government?
Yeah, so I think what they need to do for communities is to strengthen their indigenous knowledge. That's what they can do, because while working with communities, we realize that some communities already have started applying their indigenous knowledge to addressing some of the issues associated with the environment. They may not know what it's called. They may not know the name given to it called climate change, but they have been working for years. And when we did realize that, so you can imagine things as simple as clay pots. I don't know if you know the clay pots.
No, can you
These
tell us a
pots
little bit
make
about it?
so they use earths, just like I think the second layer thereabouts. They are like red earths, it's very sticky. They use it to mold pots, to mold vases and all of that. So they actually pass it through heat. So they use it to get hold water and use it for other things. So what they do is, especially when it comes to flooding, is they use these broken clay pots to rechannel the water. So what they do is, when they realize that the flooding is coming this way, they create a system where they pack all of those clay pots, like the broken ones, and then they form like a bridge to rechannel the water away from their communities. Or they see how they can go to the highlands and then be there for a while. So they create a temporary living system at the highlands where they can go there, stay for a while until when the water goes down, they come back. And if they don't want to leave their communities, or the flood doesn't seem that heavy, they have a system in which they use these things to rechannel the water. Some people even use some things like stacks to create a bridge where they can rechannel the water from entering their community, rechanneling to somewhere else. So when we learn about some of these indigenous knowledge, we were like, I think it's best the government strengthens this indigenous knowledge that they have, helps them understand how they can, be more useful with this indigenous knowledge to fighting climate change, instead of having to bring in the technological know-how or the Western knowledge, which they don't really easily resonate with, because they do not understand these things. But helping them understand how they can strengthen their indigenous effort, I think, will go a long way to fighting climate change or preventing the climate change or disaster issues at the community level. Because these people, without the help of the government, have been doing something from learning some of these skills from their fathers, their forefathers, and all of that. I think it's high time we get to ask them, what have you been doing on your own to prevent these issues, and how can we strengthen you in this area? That's one thing we're pushing for, strengthening indigenous knowledge. I think that way we can talk about prevention at the community level.
Thank you very much. It's been a fascinating conversation. I always like to end my episodes with a few questions to know you better. So I ask a few fun questions. What song brings a smile to your face? What is the last show that you binged and love? And who is your hero? And who do you look up to and why? We'll start with you, Sequoia.
Sure. So my favorite song is Happy by Pharrell Williams. Everybody really liked it, but then the more it kept playing, people were so annoyed by it, but I still like it to this day. The show that I binge and love is The Big Bang Theory. I don't know what it is. It's a cool show. I like it.
I've been
And
rewatching that again. I rewatch it all the time. It's a good show.
yes, it just attracts you. There's something about the cast. It's like very good acting and scenarios. And then my hero, I know there's a lot of heat with this person, but it is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I like her because she speaks the truth no matter what the issue is. She'll go out and support the people who have voted for her, for the people, by the people. And she speaks her mind in one of the most, if not the highest government institutions you can be in here in the US. So that's why I look up to her.
Very good hero. Blessing. Same questions to you.
Okay, so for me, one song I really resonate with is "Heal the World" by Michael Jackson. It talks so much about how we use by our hands have destroyed the environment and we don't care about it. And then for shows, I don't know. I think I'll talk about The Good Doctor. It just shows how much we are not limited by what people think of us. If we can just dig deep within, we are going to see that we're just much more than we can imagine. And then for someone who is like a hero is Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. I don't know if you know her. That's the Director General for the World Trade Organization. What do you call it now? She's like the first African, first woman. I'm inspired because I don't want to feel that I am limited just because I'm African. I don't want to feel I'm limited just because I'm a woman. I want to believe that I can reach any height I want to be and I can ascend to any height I want to. So that's why I look up to her as a hero.
That's a good way to end things. Thank you very much to both of you.